All right, picture this. You're in a band, you've just landed your big break, signed the contract, the future looks amazing. And then, the one person you absolutely cannot perform without gets seriously sick. What do you do? Today, we're diving into a fascinating story from contract law that asks that very question. What happens when a promise becomes impossible to keep? This is the case of the sick drummer. And that's really the big question we're tackling today. You've made a legally binding promise, but then the world throws a curveball so big that you simply can't follow through. What then?
So to get to the bottom of this, we've got to jump in a time machine, all the way back to the swinging 60s. Let's set the stage.
Okay, so here's our band, the Barron Knights. They're a pop group on the rise, and they've just hit the jackpot. I'm talking about the kind of major contract every musician dreams of. This was it. This was their big shot.
And who's the guy holding it all together? The heartbeat of the band? That would be their drummer, Richard Condor. And get this, he's only 16 years old. Just a kid, really, with the weight of this huge opportunity resting squarely on his shoulders.
Now this contract, it was an absolute beast. We're talking a grueling, non-stop schedule. They were required to perform every single night, 7 nights a week, no breaks. That was the core promise they signed on the dotted line for.
So everything's looking up, right? Well, this is where the whole thing starts to unravel. That pressure cooker of a schedule, it was about to blow. You know, it was just too much for a 16-year-old to handle. The grueling schedule completely broke him. Richard Condor suffered a serious mental and physical breakdown. And just like that, the band's engine seized. And this created a totally impossible situation. On one hand, you've got the contract, this legally binding document screaming 7 shows a week. But on the other, you have a doctor laying down strict orders, 4 shows a week maximum. You just can't do both. They're completely at odds.
So what do? You can't force the kid to play 7 nights a week. That would be incredibly dangerous for his health. But if they don't, they're in breach of contract, and that means facing a lawsuit that could absolutely ruin them. They were trapped between a rock and a hard place.
But this is where things get really interesting, because the law actually has a kind of escape hatch for situations just like this. It's a concept designed specifically for promises that suddenly become impossible. It's called frustration of contract, and it's a really cool idea. Basically, it says that if some random, unforeseen event pops up and is nobody's fault, and that event makes it literally impossible to go through with the deal, well, the contract just gets wiped away. It's over.
Okay, so how does a court decide if a contract is frustrated? Well, there's a 3-part test. First, something totally unexpected has to happen after you sign the deal. A sudden, serious illness. Classic example. Second, it can't be anyone's fault. And third, and this is the big one, that event has to make the whole point of the contract either completely impossible or just so different that it's not even the same deal anymore.
All right, so the band takes this idea to court. They're arguing, hey, our contract is frustrated. The stage is set for a legal showdown. But the real question is, would a judge buy it?
And this is really what it all boiled down to. Was one member's illness, which remember only partially prevented him from performing, was that enough to completely dissolve the entire contract? It's a tricky one. And the answer from the court? A clear yes. The judge sided with the band. The contract was officially declared frustrated. Boom, they were off the hook.
The judge's logic here was crystal clear. He said, look, the contract wasn't just for some performances. Its essential purpose was for 7 nights a week. Because the drummer was a vital part of the band, his inability to perform every night meant the original deal was impossible. A 4-night-a-week gig was, in the eyes of the law, a radically different thing from what they'd signed up for.
So this is a great story, but what can we take away from it? What does it teach us about the promises we make, even today?
Let's break down the crucial points. First, the law looks at the main purpose of a contract. That's everything. Second, a severe personal issue like an illness can absolutely qualify as one of those frustrating events. Third, and this is super important, the bar is high. It can't just be harder or more expensive to do something, it has to be fundamentally impossible or different. And finally, when a contract is frustrated, it just ends. No one's to blame, no one gets sued for breaking the deal, it's just over.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. This case was pretty clear, but many aren't. Where does the law draw that line between something being truly impossible versus just really, really difficult? What if the drummer could play all 7 nights, but his illness meant he played poorly? Would the contract still be frustrated then? It just goes to show how complex a simple promise can become.